call the meeting to order. This is the Planning Commission, for all you out there, this is Planning Commission of Town of Fairfax, public hearing for Thursday, January 16th. And the first order of business is the roll call.
Swift,
Here.
Newton,
Here.
Rodriguez,
Present.
Fragoso,
Here.
Kierline,
Here.
Gonzalez Parber,
Here.
Chair Green.
Here. Okay, now we're going to move on to approval of the agenda. Did anybody on the commission have any concerns about the agenda? If not, can we entertain a motion to approve?
I'll make a motion to approve the agenda.
I'll second.
All those in favor of the agenda as is, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I'd like to go over the meeting protocol. First, I want to say that I'm starting being the chair for the year, and I'm very happy to do that. I will carry on Chairman Swift's procedure of going on the right-hand side for comments and then the left-hand side for comments. I think that worked really well. And I want to mention to everybody that the chair is, in order to maintain order at the hearings in accordance with Robert's Rules of Order, which, by the way, is real. I have it right here. It's very thick. And the commission has the responsibility to be a model of respectful behavior in order to encourage community participation and citizen input at commission hearings. The commission and the audience are expected to refrain from using profane language and/or ridiculing the character or motive of commission members, staff, or members of the public, and to maintain the standards of tolerance and civility. I also would like to mention on the back of the page, by the way, there's a conduct statement, which I'd like to read. I wouldn't not mind if that were moved back up front, but we can just do that later. So all interested persons are invited to attend and participate in our public hearings. In order to give all interested persons an opportunity to be heard and to ensure the presentation of all points of view, members of the audience should please limit your presentation to 3 minutes, always address the chair, state your view and concerns succinctly, and please submit any new documents to the planning staff prior to the meeting to be entered into the record. When we have a large audience, which is not tonight, we may curb that 3 minutes somewhat to accommodate numbers of people. Okay, so now we have a section of public comments on non-agenda items. So if any member of the public would like to stand up and speak on something that is not on tonight's agenda, please do so. Well, apparently nobody wishes to make such comments, so we will close the public comments on non-agenda items. And there are no items for the consent calendar, so we will move on to the public hearing item. But before that, I understand that Commissioner Newton has a comment to make.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Green. I am recusing myself from the first public hearing item on the School Street Plaza due to personal interest. Thanks. I'll be back for the next item.
Okay, we will miss you. The staff report, please, on 6, 8, 10, and 12 School Street Plaza application number 19-15.
Okay, this item was continued from the October 17th, 2019 and the December 19th, 2019 Planning Commission meetings. At the most recent December meeting, the Planning Commission raised a number of issues and questions and asked if the applicant was willing to agree to a continuance and a waiver of the Permit Streamlining Act processing time limits to allow additional time to address those issues and questions. The applicant did not agree to the continuance, and the Planning Commission then gave their preliminary intent to deny the project. Subsequent to the December commission hearing, the town has determined that because there's no inclusionary affordable housing ordinance in the town code, the commission cannot require a housing applicant to provide affordable units, deed-restricted affordable units. The applicant can voluntarily agree to provide those units. So we advised the applicant of that, and it eliminated some of his reasons for why he had refused to agree to the continuance. So the applicant has agreed to the waiver and the extension of the project review period, which is in your attachment A to the staff report, and therefore we're recommending that the commission mutually agree to the continuance for up to 90 days. And we're recommending that you continue the project to the February 20th, 2020 meeting. And I'd like to make a couple of corrections to the staff report.
Thank you.
I have a couple corrections on the first page of the staff report.
Yes.
In the first box, the application number is actually 1915, not 1914. And the applicant had previously removed the fence height variance from his application. So where it says action, conditional use permit, design review permit, and fence height variance, it should just read conditional use permit and design review permit. And that would conclude our report.
Okay, thank you very much. At this time, I would like, I think it might be a good idea to hear from the applicant, considering the possibility of a continuance.
Chair, can we just have any commission comments on the staff report first?
Yes,
If
go
that's
ahead.
possible. So just one other correction on that front page was the different units from last meeting to this meeting. This is, I think the cover sheet that's on this one is the one from October.
Right, and it did increase
Okay.
to 15 units. Yep, thank you.
Okay, are there any other commissioner comments on my left?
I'm sorry, can you clarify that last comment?
Yeah, so when the applicant originally filed his application and you first heard it in October, the application was only for 14 units, remember? And 2 of the units were in the 6 School Street building, the 2-story building. And then we determined that you can't share bathrooms in units, and so they relocated 2 of them to the end of Building 8 and added another one. So they increased the number of units from in the application from 14 to 15 when you heard it in December.
It already came back at 15.
Right.
Any other comments? I know there was an issue about lighting and location of bathrooms and things, and is that all what the continuance is about?
Yes. We had a meeting with the applicant, and we went over again what the Planning Commission had asked for, and he indicated his willingness to provide the plans, so.
Okay, because that was one of our problems last time, is we kind of had last-minute changes. Okay, so any commissioners have any other comments? Yes?
I'm not sure if it's a comment. I think it's a question. I don't know if this is the appropriate time. I had a question about the gate, the reopening of the original school stairway that leads to the corner of Broadway and Merwin. Can I ask that question now?
That actually, oh, well.
It was one of the conditions.
Right.
I just had a question or clarification.
Okay.
Was the intent to unlock that gate to grant access to the people in the parking lot, or to have two-way circulation?
I think it depends on who you talk to, what the intent was. But we're working with the applicant to come up with maybe a solution that's acceptable to both the town and the applicant, which we're thinking will probably be just opening one way, maybe with a keypad and a code for the tenants.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
for egress from the parking lot?
Right.
Okay.
Right, but that's something that we'll discuss at the public hearing, yeah, when we hear it.
I think I raised that issue at last hearing, and that was the concern, is ingress, egress in case of emergency especially. So, yeah, okay. So,
When we hear the item next, I think, you have a list of items that the applicant is supposed to address?
Well, we attached our resolution for denial, which we thought included everything you guys had asked for at your hearing.
One thing I'm not sure is on there that is, do we have clarity as to which units are currently,
That-
currently occupied as live-work and which ones are proposed to be live-work?
I believe that was in there. We wanted them to clarify that, and they're prepared to clarify that, which
Okay,
ones are
I
being
just-
lived in and which ones are empty right now. Yeah.
Okay, that would be helpful for me. Thank you.
For point of clarification, are we then, what is the process? Will we actually hear from the applicant, or will we?
I don't think they're supposed, the
Would we
attorney advised
simply-
us that there's no public hearing.
That was my point. So would we simply either adopt a resolution of denial or continue the item at this meeting?
Correct.
With no further discussion unless we have questions as those that have just been brought up?
Staff's recommendation is to continue it to a future date, likely February. I don't know. I don't believe we had a date specific, or maybe we do. But the idea would be to provide the applicant the opportunity to respond to the items that were listed. And we went through each one of those concerns that were raised that are shown in that resolution, and the applicant indicated his willingness to work on each and every one of those. So our recommendation is to basically just move things forward, allow the applicant an opportunity to respond. Now, your commission could, if it so decides, ignore staff's recommendation and take up the resolution for denial. We've included that resolution because that was your commission's direction at the last meeting. So if that's your desire tonight, you could do so. But we always encourage, if there's a way to resolve issues short of denial and going through the appeal period and things like that, we think that that's a better solution.
Okay. Go ahead.
So I guess with the two recommendations that we have before us, one of the cautions that I want to make sure the Planning Commission understands is that there were a number of policy issues that we had yet to discuss, whether in fact the commercial space on the inside versus residential space. There's an issue being raised regarding land use, kind of density, number of dwelling units located here. Because we didn't start with general plan, rezoning, we're kind of trying to bypass that and go the conditional use permit route. We haven't had that policy discussion on that. We don't have an inclusionary ordinance, which would trigger kind of the requirement, nor do we have a live-work ordinance, so we're trying to piece something together. There's a lot of discussion there that we still have to have. We've got this illegal construction thing that really is like, what is that, and then what is this? If this was an independent application coming in just for live-work, we haven't had that discussion. And then the whole discussion around, if we're going to do the conditional use permit, then what is the range of land uses that we really we want to see here, and how does that affect what could be the uses that are there, and kind of in the physical units versus outside of the units, and then so the point for me bringing that all up is that we have these two options that staff's presenting. Do we continue the item, or do we deny the item? I'm a little leery about continuing the item because we still have to have all of those. I mean, I don't want the applicant to feel like he's got to spend a lot of money on revisions when we haven't had that discussion yet, but how do you do that when you have a continuance? I think is my dilemma, is that eventually if we have that discussion and he goes to all of that expense, then what? So I just wanted to raise that kind of oddity that's kind of out there for me.
Any comment from, that was an interesting point, so I was just wondering if you had any comment on that?
Your commission is always welcome to take up the sort of the deep dive concerns. and review it at whatever level it desires. The fact that the applicant has agreed to a continuance of up to 90 days, and it's actually the applicant and the town staff are entering into this agreement. But so if those more global issues arise in the February meeting or whenever we take it up, staff believes that we would have an opportunity to continue it again to resolve that. I guess from this staff person's standpoint, it's better for the commission to discuss whatever items they want and whether or not they're resolved, to get those out on the table. We know that oftentimes your commission is willing or desires to do a deeper level of review than the town council can or will. And so regardless of the outcome of your commission's decision, the fact is that if your commission wants to explore those items at a future meeting, they can do so. And, regardless of the outcome, at that point, the applicant or some other party would have the option to appeal it.
So I agree with everything Commissioner Rodriguez has said, and I had stated a lot of those concerns at the beginning of the reason we're looking at this application, and the fact that we don't have a live-work ordinance. There's a lot of things that ideally we would want to have and address in a live-work ordinance. And a lot of those issues with even the zoning where we're doing live-work versus the general plan are questions. So I totally agree with Commissioner Rodriguez. I think what we have before us now is the two options of the continuance or the denial. I think I'm in favor of the continuance for up to 90 days, but what I would like to see what we can do with, and we can't do it with everything that we would ideally should have in a live-work ordinance, but try and address some of those within the framework, if we can, of the application when it comes back to us. I think right now that's kind of our best options right now, considering how this application came to us and the reasons it came to us.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with both Commissioner Rodriguez and Swift, and in fact, all the comments. So there's two aspects to this I see. As one, we probably will go on with a debate on having a live-work ordinance of some kind, and that, two, this would be a learning experience for that. So I think, so I'm leaning towards continuance myself as well, because that will give us that experience of further discussion. If we deny, let me ask staff though this, if we deny this permit and they reapply at a later date, so this permit is considered only under the ordinances at the time they applied, correct? So at a later date, if they reapply, like after we might enact a live-work ordinance, which with given this year's track record, given this year's planning issues, I'm not sure if we're going to get there this year, that this project might never, see the light of day. So what we have now really is a choice of continuance, and in so learning while we do that for future live-work projects, and also our ability to we may not get another live-work project. For all we know, we might not. Is that possible that we would not have another one? So anyway,
Haven't
we
had
want
one
to
in
do
the time I've been here.
right. So we're under kind of the standard, cup situation here, and we just have to kind of take it that way, in my opinion.
Through the chair, I basically also agree with people's comments in looking at item number 5 on attachment B, page 2 of attachment B, the question of the general plan identifying the site as appropriate for 9 units versus the 15 proposed, there was nothing in the prior staff report, and so my assumption, should I assume, that in the continuing staff report, this issue would be addressed in terms of the general plan allowance and what that means and what action would have to be taken to approve 15
Yes,
units?
yes.
Okay, and one other, I think staff did a really good job of capturing most of our concerns. The one still in my mind that doesn't seem to be listed, unless I just missed it, I'm still a little jet lagged, but I had a concern about existing units being worked on that do not meet code. And there was no differentiation between those units that are currently being worked on for health and safety violations versus those new units that are coming online. I don't know if anyone else thinks that's important to have to have an understanding of what are those current health and safety issues. Am I correct in saying there are health and safety issues? Work is being done?
Staff is satisfied that the work that the applicant has done so far, which is the minimum to address those safety concerns, and specifically with egress from the bedroom areas, that has been completed. And to staff's knowledge, there has not been additional work. We haven't received any reports of it. The applicant assures us that that's not taking place. And that's certainly been the direction, is we simply wanted, recognizing that this is the type of project that could likely drag out or ultimately not get resolved, period. In the town's track record on enforcement, we felt it was important to simply address the life safety issues now and resolve whatever formal decisions are made on the property later.
And what would the process be exactly for the commission determining that 15 units would be approved rather than the 9 units in the GP?
So, that 9 units is in the general plan, and it was envisioning the rezoning of the School Street property to planned development district for housing only, right? So this is being processed under the limited commercial zoning, which does allow residential with a use permit. And it also allows the Planning Commission to make a determination that other uses are similar to conditional uses and permitted uses in the limited commercial zone. There's no density set forth. So if you feel that it can work, I believe you have the authority to approve the 15 units. The 9-unit limit, correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, it's in the housing element, and it was 9 units envisioning the rezoning of that to planned development district.
And
But I
all
do think that
residential.
when we return, what we should be looking at is what does that yield in terms of density in comparison to like types of either surrounding properties or other higher density? Like, how does that translate, that 15 or the 9? I mean, because it might not be a density that it's talking about in terms of number of people, but that's how land use is done, is quantification by density.
And staff, I know, is on top of this, but it would be good to have that in writing when the project comes back to us. The basis under which and those sections under which we would be making, should we do that, these approvals.
Absolutely. And without going into a topic that we really don't know, it's possible that the number of units may shift somewhat when the application does return, and we'll make sure that that's accurately addressed in the project information. But in the preliminary conversations with the applicant and his representative, they indicated that they're looking at this time at the number of units. So, yeah, whatever they propose, we will have that discussion.
There's a couple of, there's another health and safety issue, though, besides ingress and egress, and that was whether there might be lead paint somewhere or asbestos anywhere. I know school buildings in particular, unfortunately, were.
Yeah, they've agreed to provide you with a report.
Okay.
To have
so-
some, an
so
Number
expert
11
come out
covers
and
that.
look.
We're on
Yeah.
track for these
Yeah.
things, okay.
Can I ask a question about that? Would that be specific to the units that are being proposed for conversion or for the whole building? Or structure
Units where
complex?
construction is taking place. Yeah.
And then last meeting, I did have a question about title. Is Fred Izazi the person on the title, or was it an LLC, or what was it exactly?
They're gonna clarify that for us.
Okay. Because this agreement that was signed was just signed by Fred, you know, we need to make sure. And then there's, why is there another owner line down there? Is there another?
It's the form, that's
Okay.
just the form that the
Okay,
attorneys
good.
provided us.
So I would like to call the applicant and see if he's not here? Oh, he's not.
It's not my understanding.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that he agrees with the agreement or on the record. I
Oh,
know.
well, he signed it in front of us,
Okay,
so, in
All
front
right.
of staff.
all right, very good. So is anybody interested in proposing a motion at this time?
Can I ask another question? I'm trying to understand everything that is being proposed or pointing out as, I guess, a conflict in our process. And so I guess I would like confirmation. What I'm hearing is that in an ideal world, if we had the right sequencing of, I guess, adopting, we would have a live-work ordinance by now, but we don't. We have a situation where we have people living in unpermitted units or conditions. And we, as a planning commission, have the authority to approve a use permit based on the two things that you called out. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is that, yes, in an ideal world, we would have a live-work ordinance, but we don't. And that has not been a priority because we have a lot of other things on our agenda that are a lot more pressing. This is now, it seems like a priority because there's an applicant. And I guess I'm looking to Commissioner Rodriguez for your proposal to reconcile this situation in light of the fact that we're not going to have a live-work ordinance for a while. So what is your proposal to reconcile these two needs?
So what staff's putting before us is that we either deny it or we continue it. And I'm saying that if we continue it, then we have to, upon its return, have the policy discussions that would normally be in the ordinance. Because we don't have an ordinance, we're not going to get an ordinance as an outcome. What we're going to get is conditions of approval for a project which will then be applied in future to any other live-work type of use that's proposed until we have a live-work ordinance. And so that's what I'm saying is,
Okay. Are you recommending that we look at other ordinances in other jurisdictions as a way to weigh against our, for our approval? Or I'm not sure what the vehicle or the metric is to weigh against.
Well, that's a great idea. I think what we should do is exactly that, and that might help reconcile all this, is we did receive several jurisdictions, about 9, I think, jurisdictions, live-work ordinances. And I think between now and the time that this project comes back for hearing, if we decide to continue it and don't deny it tonight, that we study those ordinances, and staff as well, I guess, and well, you probably have, and we come up with further questions and ideas so that we can work towards perhaps an ordinance. It's just that on a practical level, I don't see how we're going to actually get to an ordinance this year, but it's possible. But we are, Commissioner Rodriguez is absolutely right. We're sort of laying the skeletal foundation for an ordinance in the future by doing this project. And so I think it behooves us all to study the other ordinances and come up with any, favorite ideas from those ordinances that we want to bring up in the next hearing. So that's my proposal, that we think about that. And I'm still interested if anybody has a further discussion, or I'd entertain a motion.
I would like to add one comment, and I agree with everything my fellow commissioners have just said. And more specifically, when the staff report comes back to us, I would like to have identified where we are in agreement with other ordinances, which features of a live-work ordinance we are basing our decision on. And my only concern would be a comment made that this would set the precedent for other live-work units moving forward, and I'm not so sure that I would want to have whatever decisions we make in regard to live-work accommodations that we make for this project, that they would necessarily regulate any other live-work applications moving forward. I would like to separate those two and not have it be the precedent-setting live-work ordinance per se.
Just one more comment from that remark. I agree with that, setting precedent. This, however, I think what we want to do when we do a resolution, if we pass this project in the future, any resolution we pass it with, all the conditions, et cetera, should say that this is a unique project, that it was already kind of under construction. I don't know if it was red tagged or not, but without permits, and therefore this is not kind of a live-work situation where we're kind of going from the ground up here. This was already in place quite a bit, and it's unique in that regard that we're trying to fill in the bits of the puzzle, building code, lighting, toilet facilities, egress, et cetera, as we go. I think it'd be really helpful to all of us if we all reviewed the various jurisdictions' live-work ordinances to get ideas for it, so that any precedent we set will be something we want to have.
So I'm prepared to make a motion. I think the fact that the applicant is not present, he hasn't removed the illegal fencing, he hasn't opened up the pedestrian access. I think we've already seen the application multiple times. The quality of the design has not improved. I think we should initiate code enforcement, and I don't think any more staff time should occur on this application or planning commission time. I recommend approval of resolution 2019-17 denying the application 1915. If I get a second, I'd like to spend some time recrafting this resolution before us.
Any second or discussion?
Well, my only concern about agreeing to it is not knowing what reconstruction we're talking about, but I do understand the commissioner's position.
I do not support adopting the resolution. I think that we have a very unique situation where the applicant has come forward. He is, to try to correct the situation. This is an existing condition, and he has been advised that he does not need to be here. I don't think, we can fault the applicant for following instructions. I think we have to work at trying to find a solution for this. We're talking about a lot of things in play here. And I think there is an opportunity to do something special and unique in Fairfax if we do it right, maybe just thoughtfully. So I personally do not agree adopting the denial.
I'd like to make one comment also, and that is, art and music is part of Fairfax's deep history. We've supported, from Irving Berlin on at least, probably going further back than Irving Berlin. And so therefore, I'm kind of in favor of a continuance from my perspective, but I thought what we might do is take a poll here and just see who may be in favor of denial and who
Well,
may...
I guess the question on the denial would be, Commissioner Rodriguez has proposed a resolution. If there's no second, then that dies. So I guess the question would be just ask for a second on that resolution.
So is there a second on that?
That was a proposal.
Yes, there is a resolution. So is there a second? Right. Hearing none, then the motion fails.
Through the chair, could staff just clarify, what is our time frame here? Does the 90-day extension come from the October 2 when it was deemed complete? Or
No, it's from
can we
this,
say it was deemed complete if we found that we didn't have sufficient information? And so when is the end of the 90-day period now proposed?
Yeah, my understanding is I think the PSA deadline actually expired 4 days ago. I mean, as a practical matter, it didn't affect the rights or actions on it. So it would be 90 days from the normal expiration of the PSA deadline. It might not get us 3 meetings out, but it would definitely get us 2.
Would it be 90 days after that, or would it be 90 days after he signed the agreement?
No, it'd be 90 days from the expiration of the normal 90-day or 60-day PSA deadline. And I believe that occurred, it was very recently. It was a matter of days.
So my
ago.
other question would be if we, a procedural question, if we're in favor of the continuance, do we need to make a motion to that effect?
Yes, move to continue, and probably to reopen the public hearing upon that continuance, just to signal that we're basically going to be opening it up to the public, and then when we advertise it, it would be a public hearing again.
Okay, more discussion, Commissioner Rodriguez?
Well, I stand corrected. According to Planner Neal, the 90-day PSA deadline is tomorrow, so we would have 90 days from, tomorrow.
So just another procedural question. So the new law just came into effect on the number of meetings an application must go through unless a decision is made January 1. Is that 3 or 4 or 5? I can't remember.
I'm not sure it's even applicable to this situation. It does involve housing, but I'd have to research that in terms of, is that a universal thing or is that within narrow frameworks?
Okay, well, that's something to think about later.
Does anybody else have a motion to propose?
Question? Did we say we were gonna, did we need to open it up to the public first before? No? Okay.
Well, that's if we come back with a continuance. At the continuation hearing, we'll be reopening the
Okay.
public.
But, okay. So I would make a motion to continue application 19, I think you said it's 15 is the correct application number, so that the applicant can respond to the items that were listed in the resolution for denial.
A friendly amendment that the applicant would respond to the items listed and additional comments and requests that were made this evening by the Planning Commission. Linda, have you got those, or all the comments that were made?
And a question as to the format of the resolution. Ben, did you say that it had to include something about re-advertising or reopening this to the public?
Yes, I believe that it would be an action by the commission. It wouldn't be a resolution. It would simply be an action, a vote taken by the commission, and part of that motion would be to reopen the public hearing
At that time?
at that time.
Okay.
So
I
are-
second.
Second, okay. All those in favor of a resolution to continue application number 1915, say aye.
Aye.
All
Aye.
those against, say nay.
Nay.
And it appears the ayes have it, as they say, and the applicant is instructed to, that is the appeal period apply here with the continuance? No.
No.
Okay, so the applicant is instructed then to follow suit and get back to us in expeditious manner. Thank you very much. So for the record, Commissioner Newton is being reseated. And then we will move on to the discussion item, the continued discussion on ADU and JADU issues and options. Planning Director Berto, please.
Thank you. As your commission is no doubt aware, the staff, and this includes the town attorney, was acting under considerable pressure and duress in taking the proposed ADU, JADU ordinance through your commission's review and then subsequent town council review. And this is both an urgency ordinance so that it took effect prior to January 1 and the regular ordinance, which the council actually took their second affirmative vote for adoption at their meeting last night. So that will become in effect 30 days from that adoption. The regular ordinance would, the urgency ordinance will be in effect until that time. As explained to your commission and to the town council, the reason that this was critically important is the state, once again, is doing this big government trend of rolling over all local jurisdiction ordinances, and in particular with this ordinance, took basically an unprecedented step of putting in a poison pill provision that said that if any portion of the local ordinance is found to be out of compliance with the statute, the state statute, that the entirety of the local ordinance would be void. So staff isn't familiar with this. I don't believe the town attorney is familiar with this. There's always a severability clause which kind of lets you craft it, and if somebody says, look, this is wrong, and then the rest of it stays in effect. No, the state said, nope, we're being very specific. If you want to push the envelope and some judge somewhere says that, that is invalid, then at that point, the entire ordinance becomes void. So with that, and utilizing the resources available to the town through the town attorney's staff, as reported either at your commission meeting or at the town council, they actually had a task force with housing law specialists. They were in communication with the State Housing and Community Development Department, and they, when we talked about the provisions, the local provisions that weren't necessarily addressed in state law, but whether or not we could do things like stream setbacks, and we had a laundry list that your commission reviewed and recommended, and those again had been thoroughly vetted by our town attorney's staff, and so they were comfortable that the ordinance as recommended fell within the confines of this new state legislation. That being said, your commission raised several outstanding issues with the parameters, what was allowed, what wasn't allowed in the ADU regulations. That was something that was entirely shared by staff. When this went to the town council agreed wholeheartedly. And I have to say that the public at both the Planning Commission and at the Town Council meeting evinced the same concerns. And I want to make it very clear for the record that this is not about NIMBYism, that the town has been very responsive in approving accessory dwelling units and junior accessory dwelling units. The rate that we've been approving them has been for the last 2 years 10 units a year. So just as by comparison, Marinda Heights involves 10 proposed dwelling units. Obviously, it's different scale and much more impactful, but that just gives you an idea of what this town has done in terms of processing and approving ADUs. And so this is not about trying to turn back the clock or to prevent people from providing what heretofore had been units which seem to do a pretty good job of matching local character and other outstanding issues. Those issues very much remain outstanding at this time, and specifically, as evinced by everybody who commented, is fire safety, and closely related to that, emergency evacuation. Staff met this week with planning directors from around the county, and I can say that other jurisdictions share the same issues that Fairfax raised. I mean, being a lifelong county resident, well, most of my life anyway, born and raised here, working in other jurisdictions in the county and having traveled on a professional basis throughout those communities, I can say that there are numerous portions of most communities in the county that have very narrow roads, that have long distances to go to a roadway that even begins to function as a reasonable emergency evacuation route. And so Fairfax's situation with those narrow, windy roads with numerous intersections that are extremely challenging to navigate in the best of times, and for the state to come in and not only say, go ahead and eliminate parking, so, you know, put a unit in the garage, which they are point blank allowed to do, and this is one of these black line state statute items that there is no fighting unless you want to be sued and lose. And to further say that they're going to bump the effective density on those parcels to triplexes, what amounts to triplexes, because if somebody is converting an existing single-family residence into a single-family residence with a junior accessory dwelling unit, it's understood that there's no regulation or limit on how that space is divided up. So people can effectively bisect their house into a duplex if they so desire. The state has further, with certain limitations, eliminated any required parking. And what we know in Fairfax is the situation is not good as it stands. I haven't seen the extent of what people commonly refer to as parking wars in Fairfax that we have seen in other communities, but there's many skirmishes that occur on a daily, if not weekly basis, and I'll get into some of the causes and things that might exacerbate it in a minute. But the state taking that action to say that let's just assume that nobody's going to be driving cars anymore is myopic at best, and in staff's opinion is directly counter to public safety. So that being said, staff listed a number of issues with the ADU ordinances, and this is again from your commission, from the council, from members of the public, and from what staff has researched, and those are listed as fire safety, emergency evacuation, parking, short-term rentals, ADU size, illegal non-conforming structures. Another item that was raised was zoning districts where ADUs and JEUs are allowed, and finally ADU, JEU chapter organization, the format of the chapters. So looking at fire safety, and this has been an ongoing conversation between staff and council. And what was pointed out, and you have in front of you a copy of Fairfax's fire hazard severity zones, and this is directly from the state. Upon request, staff also provided the metadata from the origination of that. What can be seen is this is not a WUI, wildland-urban interface diagram or designation. This is from the State Department of Forestry. And what you can see is, I would guess 90% of the town is in a high fire severity zone. And that's one of those, well, of course it is. And I would even argue that the portions of the town which are currently only designated as moderate fire severity, for example, Deer Park, really? Are we kidding? And some of the area off Glen Drive would likely be more appropriately designated as high fire, and staff will work on efforts to get that designation shifted. But we're dealing with a 90+% of the town is a high fire hazard severity zones. Now, I will give the state some credit in Senate Bill 330. What they've done is they've said that if areas are in high fire hazard severity zones, those provisions do not apply. So those are things where they add on numerous stories to proposed development, up to quadruple the density over local zoning ordinances in terms of what's allowed if proposed development meets certain standards. The state at least is recognizing that when we're getting into high density, high number of units, housing developments, that it really would be criminally stupid to impose those standards in areas that are in high fire hazard severity zones. Nonetheless, I would term it myopic at best to say that, well, because we're simply dealing with, in the case of new ADUs, an 1,100 square foot size limit, or that we're just bisecting an existing structure, or converting, garage structures, et cetera, that's not going to be problematic. It really goes counter to what any type of detailed analysis of the situation would result. The problem is the state could have done the same type of designation that they did for SB 330 for high density development in this ADU regulations. They did not. The fact that the state is silent on that indicates that they are aware of at least the potential issue and don't care, that they're simply saying, live with it. Now, we don't know that for an absolute certainty. One of the options that staff is proposing is a legislative amendment. And ultimately, that's the way you get clarity, is to actually have the statute say that, look, if you're in a high fire hazard severity zone, you don't triple the number of units and eliminate parking. So that's an effort that hopefully towns through the League of California Cities and other organizations, including local, can begin that discussion. As stated in the staff report, we believe that the trends that we're seeing out of the state, and this has been ongoing for several years, is completely in the opposite direction. That what we're seeing is every year they're rolling out more legislation to take away more local tools, additional local tools, and mandating more development. And it should also be noted that we do have a housing crisis, that we all know the extreme price of housing, the extreme shortages in this area, and that it's basically, there is no such thing as affordable housing if we're dealing with market rate circumstances. So the state is trying to address that with their take on it. But here we sit in Fairfax with a community that really gets the fire risk issues, where we have the most fire safe neighborhoods. No, what's it called again?
Fire-wise.
Fire-wise neighborhoods. In a county that has the most fire-wise neighborhoods, and the rate of increasing of those neighborhoods is really something to behold. And I'm sure Commissioner Swift, who has been instrumental in that effort, can talk further about what's really occurring on the ground to try to address those problems. So, we just keep plugging away and seeing, what options there are. But I would be remiss if I said that it appears that either A, there's going to be a legislative solution, or there's an easy answer in terms of a code amendment that would do what seems to be the sensible thing that says, if you're going to have units, you need to get those vehicles off the street, for example. Or if you're going to have those units, it's probably not a good idea to get them a mile up Cascade Canyon, on a bunch of roads that have extreme drivability issues. So those are the challenges. In terms of other fire safety aspects, evacuation route, emergency evacuation. And this, again, it's not just that you have a lot of people that are in a high fire risk area or a WUI high fire hazard area. And we've heard from the experts, they say that it's not a question of whether, it's just a question of when that we get one of these severe fires that the state has been experiencing on a yearly basis. So there's the inherent fire safety issue that putting in large numbers of units. And we don't know how many it will be. We've been fielding, I believe, at least a couple phone calls a day from people interested in pursuing this. And so we believe that there will be at least the annual rate that we've experienced in the last couple of years going forward. But it's hard to say yet. In terms of emergency evacuation, this is something that we've had preliminary discussions with Ross Valley Fire. They're sympathetic to this issue. I mean, obviously, as the professionals who would be taking over in fire or any number of emergency evacuation circumstances, them and police, they're acutely aware of the challenges presented. They're starting to take steps to improve the designated evacuation routes. But as a practical matter, and this was brought to staff's attention in the newspaper reports, that there's any number of communities in Marin that have extremely adverse evacuation circumstances right now. And based on this one report, Fairfax is 13th in the state, the entire state. And this is, some firm that just evaluates what percentage of traffic has to go on what number of streets, how many options do you have? And so, when you're considering thousands of communities, and Fairfax is barely out of the top 10, and as pointed out in the staff report, compared to Sleepy Hollow, which, Butterfield Road is probably 50 feet wide in a straight shot. I just kind of question, you're just looking at one metric, which is, I guess people living in Sleepy Hollow all go out on Butterfield Road. But if you're looking at Fairfax, you really can't be looking at Forest or some of these other, 15-foot wide streets as a better situation just because it's an option beyond Cascade Drive. So we're really in a bad situation. We will work with fire to try to come up with some metrics that can evaluate the evacuation risk and the severity of evacuations. Again, because of the current statutes, I'm not sure how much we can do with that at this time, but at the very minimum, an example of where this might be applicable is we're coming up with the regional housing needs assessment numbers. Those will be forthcoming within a year or so, and this is the thing that the state says, hey, we need you to provide your fair share of regional housing to try to address the state and regional shortfall in housing. And there are various indices that go into the algorithms that they use to determine what that number should be. And again, in speaking with other planning directors, including one who is on the housing assessment committee, the thought is to come up with our own metrics or try to develop that and try to look at fire safety and evacuation problems and feed that into that so that at least there's some acknowledgement that the communities that are in Fairfax's situation don't get penalized or don't ignore what we have in front of us in terms of clear and present dangers for putting lots more housing in these terrible evacuation routes. Another issue with the current state statutes has to do with parking. As noted, the state statute specifically encourages, and I'll use that word, the conversion of garages to second units. And maybe this is to try to address the issue that if you're building a brand new JADU, you're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars to build a livable dwelling unit. So there's probably a lot of people in town who've already converted their garages. And the new state statute says, hey, whatever the problems are with those garages, they've got 5 years to fix it. So they're really encouraging people to come in with ADUs and start that process of reconciling code deficiencies with those ADU conversions. The problem is, of course, is it puts the parking on the street. And this ties directly into Fairfax's emergency evacuation issues and fire safety issues, is that we already have too many cars in the street. This will make that problem worse. So this one, however, we at least have some options. And the town has looked at some of these options in the past. They were highly controversial, and the final decision was to not do much. But among those could be to create a parking permit program. And you see these in effect throughout the Bay Area. You see the signs up in communities like Berkeley or San Francisco where they say, no parking overnight or beyond X number of hours unless you have, except for K or L designated, and people who live there can go down, pay their permit, register their vehicles to a certain address and get their sticker on the car so that they don't get cited or towed. So Fairfax could pursue that program. It's my understanding that there was some conversation about that. There have been in the past. It was probably a solution that was viewed at that time as being more painful than the problem, but it's within the town's control to do so. Now, something that militates against that option is, once again, the state in their wisdom have said that if people in these ADUs and JADUs that we're going to be creating aren't offered permits, then that permit program is inapplicable. So it almost seems like the problem that this step would be intended to address, it wouldn't, because everybody's going to be slapping stickers on their cars, and there you go. You're going to have the same problem. Another option, and something with which staff is professionally familiar, has to do with designated parking areas. And it should be noted that the town has some format of that, wherein they have painted white stripes on the edge of the road to attempt to designate where vehicles can park. And this is before my time. It's my understanding that fire and police were part of that process. And so at least initially, where those spaces were designated represented a collaborative effort among people who are in a position to say, yeah, this looks safe from a remaining lane width or sight distance or turning radius standpoint. Staff has heard anecdotally that some people have taken it upon themselves to go out there with a can of white paint and create their own roadside parking spaces, which sort of defeats the whole purpose of having your professionals such as fire and police also evaluating it. And staff worked in Corte Madera when they implemented a parking permit program, or excuse me, not parking permit program, but a parking designation program in Christmas Tree Hill. And I don't know if you've been up Christmas Tree Hill, but that's one of those places that's as sketchy as Fairfax is, in terms of the roads getting narrower and narrower and the shortfalls of parking. And they did have parking wars where cars were getting keyed, and people had those "don't even think about parking here" signs and things like that. So it's something that I believe if the town wanted to undertake it, it would be very controversial, very staff resource intensive. It could provide some solutions where For example, we could use GIS programs to very accurately identify where those spaces are. We could go further than just simply having painted stripes on the edge of the road and actually do chevrons demarcating the edge of the parking spaces, such as you see in any of the downtown areas where, there's your box that you can park in. So the town could take that step and undertake this program. It would involve, obviously, everybody who lived in those neighborhoods. It would have to be heavily publicized. There would be a lot of unhappy people. Staff believes at the end of the day, that may be the only option that would actually address the issue of too many cars and a problem getting much worse with vehicles parked on the street. When people start to convert their parking areas to on-street parking, and when we start to double or triple the density of housing units, and let's face it, in Marin County, people don't have options to the automobile, not yet. It's questionable whether the pie-in-the-sky autonomous driving vehicles is ever going to work in roads that aren't mapped with tree foliage blocking satellite signals, et cetera, et cetera. So people are going to be driving cars for the foreseeable future, and you're going to need to find a place to stable those cars. So this is one option that could address some of the worst aspects of what we anticipate will be just a plethora of cars and not enough places to park it. Another option, and this ties into a conversation that your commission has previously had, is the town currently requires covered parking for at least a portion of required parking on new residential developments. And your commission actually considered the possibility of relaxing that standard to say, why not just allow people to park in uncovered parking areas? And in discussions among staff, one thought, and we don't know what the state's going to do next, but one thought would be if we had parking decks and the like on the side of the road or where people park, that would make it less conducive to conversion to an ADU. In other words, we know that garages, many of them are used for many things besides parking. It may be a reflection of how bad the on-street parking is, whether or not people continue to use their so-called garages for parking vehicles. But if we have uncovered parking, it's more likely that those would continue to be utilized for vehicular parking. For one thing, you don't have the security for storing things. They're exposed to the elements, et cetera. So putting in parking decks versus putting in garages would make it seem more likely that those designated parking spaces would remain usable for parking and not end up in a situation where the state waves their legislative wand and says, those shall be dwelling units, which create, the removal of the parking and the demand for additional parking for that unit itself. So that's another probably less painful option than some of the other ones we noted. Another issue has to do with short-term rentals. Marin County is a very desirable place to come and stay and vacation. Fairfax is attracting a unique crowd, the mountain bikers, for example. And it's known just in our day-to-day processing of applications and handling of complaints that oftentimes the short-term rentals become a flashpoint for neighbor ire. And that's because people don't get that you have to be considerate of other people in parking situations. They may not really understand where the appropriate place to park is or isn't. And frankly, if they're showing up on a Friday night and they're looking to party, they're not going to spend a lot of time figuring out parking. And maybe if they're halfway in front of somebody's driveway or parking in front of their property, which is, their right on a public right-of-way, those type of things, the informal rules about parking in front of your parking go out the window. So one option would be to formally ban short-term rentals, and there's a whole bunch of places. Airbnb gets the headlines, but there's a whole bunch of other companies that do that type of thing. Again, the advantage with that is you wouldn't get that influx of people who are completely unfamiliar with parking and they're all showing up in cars. So that might help address some of the more flashpoint issues. ADU size. In terms of ADU conversions, there's really very little that limits that maximum size. Fairfax, it's not as problematic, but I've heard discussions about communities that have barns that are 5 or 10,000 square feet, and in theory, that could become an ADU. I mean, it's going to be fascinating to see the legal cases that arise out of this legislation, because some of this is truly the tail wagging the dog. You want a 10,000 square foot building, build a 10,000 square foot barn and convert it to an ADU, ministerially approved. So those are the type of things that we're going to monitor. We can't really do much about at this time. Another one that would seem to turn historical jurisprudence on its head has to do with the ability to convert non-conforming structures to ADUs. And I'm frankly astonished that this would seem to give people a pass on illegal structures, because it just seems to be like planning 101, that you don't get grandfathered for something that is illegal and always was illegal. Again, it's people starting with something and then simply saying, well, it's an ADU, now you have to bless it, it's memorialized in law, there's nothing you can do about it. That's just a terrible precedent. So we anticipate there will be litigation on that topic, and hopefully the judicial precedents that are set will allow us to simply say, no, if it's an illegal structure, you don't get to grandfather it by calling it an ADU. The relatively minor issue about zoning districts where ADUs, JADUs are allowed, it would appear that some type of housing is allowed in all zoning districts in Fairfax, but 2. And you read the zoning and you go, wow, this is just accessory to an agricultural use. Not that we have any agricultural use anymore. But given that, it's probably best to just simply allow people to discover what is or isn't permitted. Obviously, your standard residential districts, people are going to understand that they can put in ADUs there. Chapter organization. Yeah, this was a hurry-up ordinance, so everything got crammed into, was it 1748-110, with all sorts of letters instead of the typical chapter reorganization. As we get into conversations about what type of changes we can do, those would be the type of things where we might reorganize that chapter so that it's a little bit more legible and user-friendly and has your typical breakdowns in terms of numerical categories. Yeah, so in terms of other agencies, like I said, fire is willing to work with us, and we intend to follow up with them on that basis. In closing, and I've talked far too long, but I would say that the news right now is not good. The state has really taken away a lot of local jurisdictions' ability to regulate these things. It's put communities such as Fairfax in a very risky, adverse situation with respect to fire safety. We're going to continue to push to amend that, but to change regulations at this time would not be a good bet from a legal standpoint. Your commission and the council may elect to do so anyway. Staff's recommendation, of course, is not to put the town into a legally challenged position, but that's up to your commission and the town council and the people of Fairfax to ultimately decide. I believe that there will be a multitude of lawsuits arising out of this. There will be communities that simply say, we'll bite the bullet and fight this. And those type of, even if you lose the court case, a lot of times the subsequent fallout from the publicity will spur some legislator to realize that probably not a great idea, and then there's a future change in the law. I don't know if it would help the community that ends up losing the court case, but that's where we're at. So I'm here to hear your recommendations and considerations.
Well, thank you, Bert, for that incredible summary and this really good review of the issues that we have. And we're facing horrendous issues, but I think the fire safety thing is the biggest problem at a practical level. But can I ask, let me ask my commissioners on the left if you have any questions of staff.
I have a question. Does the town have the authority to, I guess, install, for lack of a better word, like a pre-application process for these projects?
We could, but the intention of the state is to do the opposite, is to have a very streamlined ministerial process. In certain circumstances, we don't even require what we call an ADU permit. So they just go straight to a building permit. So I'm not sure what that would achieve, if indeed, it were advisable to try to do it.
Right. I guess I'm trying to figure out how, I guess we could avoid a lot of work for you guys, just because, just in my experience, what I'm experiencing is that a lot of clients, are very enthusiastic and they go down a road and then they find out that they can't afford the project. And it's very, very expensive for everybody. And then ultimately, the optimism wanes and nothing happens. And that's happening more and more with every fire. Resources, labor, there's a shortage. And so I'm just trying to figure out how, because I could see you guys getting overloaded trying to process these applications that might go nowhere. So I'm just wondering if there's some kind of stopgap where to educate people in advance, so that it kind of just shuts down a lot of the efforts if they can't afford it. And I don't know, I don't know, it's kind of a brainstorming session that may have to happen to figure that out.
I can report that the county, the jurisdiction in the county are taking advantage of a Senate Bill 2 grant funding, and we're working on 3 things: objective development standards, inclusionary housing, and accessory dwelling units. And one of the things that we probably could explore with accessory dwelling units is that kind of early reality check. So when people realize that it's going to cost you $400 a square foot, and I know MMWD is waiving their fees, but there are other, I'm not even sure the full range of fees, but out of that, I think that seems to be a good suggestion to do at a kind of a global level where people could understand that, yeah, this is what it's going to be, a ballpark that it's going to cost, and why take up a bunch of staff time if you don't have $200,000 or $500,000?
Yeah, it's more like $500,000 is what I'm hearing. So I'm also, you mentioned something about the cost of building something, and it's actually a lot more expensive to remodel something. And with a lot of our structures here in Fairfax, which are not code compliant for structural, for seismic, it's very expensive to upgrade a structure, especially a lot of the little cottages that were built way back when, they're not intended to house people. They would never comply. And so I think that's maybe, I don't know if there's a way to educate our public on the reality of actually, realizing this ADU, because I think there's a lot of excitement, and I'm on both sides of this because I see, the benefits, but for Fairfax, the dangers. So I don't know, maybe it's just a matter of educating people about the process, which is tough enough for professionals to figure out. So it's one way.
Any other comments to my left?
I don't really have specific questions for staff. I mean, I have some comments, but I think we'll save it for the discussion.
Okay, we'll get to the discussion soon. How about on my right? Questions for staff? Oh,
Sorry, I did have one comment. I think I mentioned it before regarding emergency evacuations. It seems to me an option perhaps somebody could look at is when there was a fire at up the hill from my house on Myrna. I noticed that fire engines were coming up and being blocked by cars that were coming and going up and down the hill. And it may be a good idea to take a look at streets where we might make them one direction. I know everybody, including myself, would hate this, but when I stood out there watching cars coming down the hill it was late at night, so every single parking space was taken on the other side of the street. And the fire engine had to like wait and honk and see, is the car gonna back up or is the fire engine backing up? And then the fire trucks would come in and go up the other way to get up the hill, and they were still being blocked by people driving around the hill. So I'd like to just mention that once again.
any questions for staff on my right?
So I'm going
Commissioner Swift?
to save my comments on the staff report and where I want to see us change this and the direction I would like to see us go with this, but I wanted to make two after we hear from the public. But I wanted to make three comments now that Norma mentioned that fire. 3 comments. One, I listened this morning to the December council meeting on this, and there was a lot of confusion with the discussion on the items in the ADU. Some of it was incorrect information that was given out, I think. One of the questions that came up, and it was a question including from Councilmember Ackerman, related to short-term rentals. And the question was, in the new state law, there is a prohibition to short-term rentals less than 30 days. And that
Is that a question?
No, I'm making a statement. Just as far as to the mention of the listening to the commission, to the council. And that was stated as that was new in the new state law. And Councilmember Ackerman's question related to, can we do anything with short-term rentals in these? And can we go back? Is it retroactive? And nobody brought up the point that we already have a prohibition in the existing ADU law that we did a couple years ago as the last round of making changes to our ADU or local ADU laws to conform with state law. And at that point in time, we had the flexibility. One of the few things we had flexibility to do was to prohibit short-term rentals of ADUs. So the Planning Commission at the time, and I had raised the issue, we took it up and we said we want to prohibit short-term rentals on ADUs, 30 days less, so that we could try and protect those for housing. So that was and is in the existing one that was in effect until this new law came out. So that was confusing as far as information that was put out in that council meeting because nobody addressed what we already had done in that. A question on the maps. So that's one thing I wanted to mention, a question on the maps. So we have a CPUC fire hazard map in the state where we're part, in the WUI, we're tier 3, the highest tier. This map is the CAL FIRE map, and it doesn't show an effective date on it, but I believe the maps that apply to Marin County from CAL FIRE are from 2007. And you can double check that on their website, and there's been comments about needing to update those. So, using this, it's the current CAL FIRE map, but it's also 2007, and they're probably in the process of updating those. So that's kind of the concern in using maps, and wanting to know where the data is from and the currency of that data.
So I guess the question is, what age is this map?
Well, to verify, this isn't current, the map's 2007, so you can make your thoughts on that it's over 10 years old as far as how they perceive that. And as to the Norma's comment about that fire, if that was the fire that was on Crest, Norma, that you're referring to. So one of the issues I know with that fire was, and the issues that the fire department had getting up there, is that people were evacuating and leaving that area even though they were told in an alert Marin messaging not to do that. So those are, issues we're going to run into. So those are my comments, and I'll save my other till after public hearing. Thank you.
Okay, any other, let's stick to questions for staff right now, please.
My question for staff is, so this is a beautiful report that lays out a lot of ideas. And when I was reading it, I was trying to think about, okay, what is the Planning Commission's role? And so is the question before the Planning Commission, do we want to initiate an amendment to the parking ordinance, the non-conforming ordinance, the residential ordinance regarding the short-term rental, the PDCS ordinance to delete residential? Is that the question for us tonight? And then, so I just kind of wanted to make sure that we're all aware that those things are in our charge. The things in this document that are not in our charge are, we cannot initiate legislative amendments. We cannot direct actions in emergency evacuation areas. We cannot say you must collaborate or do trainings or initiate more money on code enforcement. We can articulate a memo from the Planning Commission to the Town Council saying those things. So I just kind of want to be clear about what are we trying to do tonight?
Yes, the staff report sort of used code for things that we can do and things that we can't do. So when it was talking about legislative solutions, obviously that's get together with a bunch of different jurisdictions. That's go talk to our local senators and representatives. And that's a long-term solution. And really, those decisions are out of the town's hands. The ones that we could do something about would be things like parking programs and designations, or taking a more global perspective. Commissioner Swift was correct in noting that the prior ADU ordinance and the current ADU ordinance both prohibit short-term rentals. Such rentals are not explicitly allowed in our zoning ordinance anyway. So by inference, because it's not specifically allowed, it's banned. But it would be easier to simply apply that town-wide, to have that specific prohibition. And that, in turn, might assist with this parking issue. So those are probably the three or the two global areas where the town could make a change right now. And then, frankly, staff's sort of at an impasse because, again, based on the research we've done and the conversations with the legal experts, just recognizing that the state has put us in a very adverse position from a fire safety standpoint. It's just additional conversation, and we're dealing with very intelligent people. We'd love to get your input on if there's other options that we haven't thought about.
So if I may, the recommendation that's in the staff report is to provide staff with direction on ADU, JADU work options, and continue the discussion at the February 20th Planning Commission meeting. Any other comments on my right? Commissioner Newton?
Thank you. Questions, really. And I'll just dovetail off of what Commissioner Rodriguez asked, because, you know, I'm struggling with the big picture here. Excuse me. You know, one of the things you've talked about is objective development standards. And, you know, I'm trying to understand, are you looking for our recommendations as to how we might supplement the new ADU ordinance with respect to things that aren't going to be perceived of as a poison pill with respect to that existing ordinance? You know, and I definitely think that's where you're getting at with the parking programs. But I'm a little confused, sort of from the larger perspective of whether or not the idea of concrete, measurable, objective standards is something that you're thinking we could include in an ordinance that wouldn't suffer from being a poison pill, because the way I was reading the new legislation, almost anything that we do to put any extra burden on the development of ADUs has the potential to undermine any ordinance we put together.
Yes, my discussion of the objective development standards was also in the context of the inclusionary ordinance and the future ADU work that's being done under the auspices of the Senate Bill 2 grant funding that every jurisdiction in Marin is receiving. So it's effectively independent of the ADU discussion. It was just in the context of Commissioner Gonzalez-Parber's question about, is there some way to not lead applicants down the primrose path when they get to the end of it and they get a bid on the job and it's 3 times what they can afford? So don't worry about the objective. It's just we're working on those 3 items, and one of them might relate to the question about giving people a heads up that it's going to be a lot more expensive than most of them think.
Okay, so I take that answer to mean that ideas that might constitute objective development standards that might help us with the fire safety issues are not really on the table, like minimum street width in order to take advantage of the new requirements.
Well, yes, that's certainly something that we could look at. I'm aware that San Rafael for years had that requirement.
Yeah, but the attorney told me you can't.
Right. So, but those are the type of things we want to explore. Is maybe there's a stone that we've left unturned that could somehow help us. But those are the type of questions that we want to get from your commission. Well, what about things like that? And then we can go back to our attorney, and maybe they have a conversation with HCD. One of the things I didn't mention is whatever modification we do has to be routed to HCD as the current ordinance is. And so we would get some feedback before, while it's still in draft form, before it's implemented, that this is acceptable or this isn't. So feel free to posit whatever objective standards or metrics or ideas that you have, because we can follow up on those and get an idea of whether or not it's likely to be acceptable or not.
All right, well, thank you. Fire safety has been a concern of mine since, you know, the firemen came to the school in the 6th grade and gave out little badges and stuff. And so I got my dad to take the paint thinner out of the garage near the water heater, things like that. I mean, we have to be aware of these things. But I think, would an objective standard be to take a map like this, make it much more accurate, and kind of go back to the fire department and say, look, on a street-by-street basis, in certain of our evacuation areas, you know, what's your best day, right? What would they like to see make it easier for fire trucks to get up there. I mean, after all, when we do planning, especially in hill districts, we're constantly looking at fire truck turnaround areas, making sure those are available, you know, so just likewise, I mean, maybe this is a question for the legal side of it, but would it not be an objective standard if the fire department says, you know, maybe this street ought to be parking on one side only, or something like that, you know? Or maybe, you know, or so for example, you know, we have communities, so Forest Avenue, you know, which is up on a ridge, has a little parking lot at one end of it. You know, would things like that improve? I mean, I don't know how we'd implement it in some areas, but are these the types of objective standards? So this is the question, is what objective standards would fly? That's my big question. But one of them I'm thinking of is, you know, getting really detailed street maps on this large map, up to date, of course. Cindy Swift's comment is well taken. And seeing, you know, what would the fire department like to see for evacuation purposes to avoid, perhaps, the traffic situation as in the, you know, the fire we had here.
It's a good observation and one that we can bring to the fire department's attention. We know that fire is sympathetic. I mean, their job is to save lives and to not put people in danger. And certainly they've had a major wake-up call about what current development patterns pose in terms of risks. So I think those type of questions about, okay, we've got this development area, you know, based on our local fire crews' intimate knowledge of those streets, you know, what do they recommend? I mean, what would improve emergency evacuation? What are the things that are the major limiters? That one Crest fire, yeah, we have somebody in our office who was saying that people were hitting cars, parked cars when they were driving out and driving on shoulders and things like that. So it was problematic, and that was one house that the fire didn't spread. So those are the type of questions that we need to get into with fire.
Right, and of course, I mean, I would think that as far as like our selling a program like that, parking regulation program to the public, would be easy, because if you live in the area and you're concerned about fire, which everybody is since Santa Rosa, et cetera, you would want your house to be accessible by a fire truck, would you not? I mean, logically. So the question I really have, though, is that an objective standard that we can use to help keep our communities safe?
It's a question that should be asked. Whether or not it gets traction at the state level at this time, I don't know, but we could certainly ask that question.
Okay, any other questions of staff?
Well, I didn't know if we got into comments, because that was a comment.
Well, it really was a question is whether that would be an objective standard.
Okay.
Whether, yes. If it would, could it be an objective standard that we can kind of detail? That's really the question. So is it appropriate to open this up to public hearing now? And we will do so. Anybody in the public, in our audience, who would like to comment on this program? You don't have to state your name and residence, but it would be nice if we knew who you are. We do know who you are, Frank. Thank you. Okay, if you could hit the microphone button. Thanks, Frank.
I'm getting to the microphone. Your staff, you know, covered the fire issues, clearance issues, evacuation issues quite well. And we have to remember, for instance, the Kincaid fire, this last year's Kincaid fire in Sonoma County, at some points was traveling 1 mile per minute. So, you know, and during the red flag day, if a fire started at Elliott Nature Preserve, it would burn through the Cascade Canyon and come out of Blenus Road in 2 minutes. That's how much time we'd have to get out of that canyon if under the same kind of circumstances that they faced in that Kincaid fire. In the year before, at the Tubbs fire, Coffee Park burned, and that wasn't a wildland fire, that was a house-to-house fire. And they're asking you to allow setbacks 4 feet, really close. My goddaughter, who lived in Coffee Park, went out to check on her dad on Guerneville Road and returned to her house 2 hours later, and it was gone. It came across Highway 101 and blew through Coffee Park, took out like 1,500 homes there in 2 hours. It was unbelievable what happened up there. So it's a real issue for us here at Fairfax. A couple of other things that I brought up, and staff mentioned the short-term rentals. You know, right now we have no way to identify short-term rentals. Fairfax has an ordinance. It's where is the town code? I've got chapter 3.32. It's a hotel users tax, actually a transit occupancy tax, and the Fairfax Inn pays, I think, 10% of a tax for those renting a room overnight. And when you read the ordinance, it covers not only an inn, it covers dwelling, lodging, sleeping purposes, and includes any hotel, inn, bed and breakfast in tourist home or house, motel, mobile home, or other lodging. So in effect, it covers short-term rentals in Fairfax now, and there are a number of them. You know, in 2000 we estimated about 300 second units in Fairfax, some legal, some not. 20 years later, we've probably added another 100. The staff has said you've had 10 a year for the past 2 years. There's 20. And so if you look at the other 8 years that we're getting 10 a year, that's another 80. So we're probably got close to 400 of them. And Fairfax, for some reason, doesn't want to deal with trying to identify them. There's Airbnb, VRBO, HomeAway, FlipKey, Cool Stay, just to name a few. And I figure Fairfax is losing a minimum of $100,000 a year in income if they charge just a 10% a tax on these short-term stays. It could be as much as $200,000 a year, but for some reason Fairfax doesn't want to look at this issue, and I think we need to. And then for the ordinance, rather than making this a boon for Airbnb operations, let's really zero in on them, and let's get them to pay their fair share. And in the beginning, we can collect that 10% right now. We don't have to have a special ordinance. There's these outfits will come in and run a test for us to see how many we have in town, and just start collecting the fees. And in the meantime, you can work on an ordinance to regulate them, however you want to regulate them. Another issue is we always talk about affordable housing, but the state is not creating any affordable housing. You know, they're mandating all the cities to add a large number of units, but they're not requiring them to be affordable at all. And so an issue I suggested is that we put a rent control on new ADUs approved after 2000. And that way, for sure, we know it's going to be an affordable rental unit rather than a market rate rental unit. What else was on here?
I'm sorry, Frank, would you say that one again, that last point you were saying?
So trying to create affordable housing. So in effect, if we have rent control on new ADUs created after January 1st, I'm not talking about the existing ones, but after January 1st, any new ADU, if Fairfax required rent control on that ADU, we could in fact guarantee it would be an affordable unit. So I mentioned the setbacks. It's the closest, and the fire issues.
Okay, Mr. Egger,
Yes.
your 3 minutes are up.
Okay, that's fine. That's all. I just want to come down
But
and
thank you for the
and
memo.
mention some of those things because Fairfax Fairfax has been in the forefront of affordable housing for a long time. And, I don't mean to tell you I don't want to run over my 3 minutes, but for instance, I was personally sued for stopping a condo conversion of Piper Court Apartments a number of years ago. I was sued for $1 million+ by the developer who bought Piper Court Apartments, and it was going to convert them to condos. And I had written the ordinance that prohibits condo conversions in Fairfax, and he sued me personally. So I mean, I've been through the wars, and that case went all the way to the California Supreme Court, and the ordinance that I had drafted was upheld. So we have it on the books.
Thank you for doing that work. We appreciate it. Could you hit the microphone button? Oh, yeah. Did you have a question? Mr. Egger, could you come back, please? We have a question from a planning commissioner. Rodriguez.
Sorry to bring you back up.
No.
Thank you for doing this. I like some of these ideas. On number 2, the new ordinance to allow ADUs, to not allow ADUs, you put WUI. Earlier, we were talking about the CAL FIRE maps as well as the State Department of Forestry, and I think that's one issue that we're all kind of talking about is what is the right map. But why did you put WUI here? That's one of 3 questions I have.
Well, that's a wild urban interface zone.
I know what it is, but why did you choose that versus CAL FIRE or the Department of Forestry map?
So in Marin County, the Marin County Fire Department is CAL FIRE. They are CAL FIRE here. Now there's Marin County Fire, but CAL FIRE pays them to be CAL FIRE in Marin County. So there's a real connection between the two. I wasn't trying to differentiate whether it be CAL FIRE or Marin County Fire.
Okay.
And you also have one of the 8 1974 open space element maps is a fire hazard zone. And someplace, town hall, there's that map.
Okay, the second question I had is on number 4, initiate the regulation of short-term rentals in conjunction so that after January 1, is that shall not be rented?
Shall be rented short-term, after.
So you want ADUs to be short-term rentals?
You're right, it should say not, huh?
Yeah, okay.
Oh, my
I
gosh.
just wanted to better understand your point.
Nice catch.
Yeah.
Nice catch. Thank you very much.
And then just another
Nobody caught that before.
final question on number 7. So you say make an exception to the state setback requirements. This is an interesting idea in the WUI area. So you're saying go back to what setbacks? Are you saying?
Keep existing setbacks. So like on a flat lot, it's 5 on one side, 10 on the other. The front and back are what are the front and back? I think the front and back it's 6 and whatever it is.
Okay.
Your
All right.
current
Okay,
codes.
thank you.
And the states say you have to go to 4 feet. And what I'm saying,
Okay.
if you go to 4 feet, it's going to house-to-house fire. We're going to lose them
Right.
all. We'll lose the whole block.
Good suggestions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any further public comments? Please come forward. Thank you.
Good evening, Rick Hamer, Fairfax. First on the map, the 2007 map is dated way before the clear and present danger of wildfires started in recent history, which is really pretty much 2015 with the Valley Fire was the first of the firestorms that really caught the public eye, followed by the Santa Rosa fires and Paradise fires. So using a 2007 reference is somewhat dated. However, it already designates Fairfax as being entirely in the high-risk area, and that should be probably noted. To the state and whoever wrote this, and the state legislature who approved this particular ADU ordinance, there's a number of inconsistencies between the efforts by the state in order to increase housing, whether it be market rate housing or affordable housing. I think the ADU ordinance is aimed at market rate housing. some of the inconsistencies, for example, that I know based on projects that I'm working on are the definition of a transit within the distance of a transit stop. So we know that there's some work to be done, and I really think that being somewhat of a community noted for this, as Mr. Eggers said in a previous public comment, the pushback has to start somewhere, and I think it should start here. Really, that when a ordinance is written around flatlands like Fremont and Oakland and Berkeley, where there's streets and they're wide and there's ADUs and we're trying to pack as many people, these one-size-fits-alls do not apply to Fairfax, where we have a real access issue that does not exist in Fremont. I just took 9 trips to Fremont. Every time I went, Siri directed me a different way to go. There's only 2 ways in and out of Fairfax. Siri will not direct 9 ways in and out of Fairfax. If there, with only 2 ways in and out of Fairfax, and especially with the high-risk areas having narrow streets, we need to push back on behalf of those other 13 risk areas who are listed above us, and we really need to put it on the state's radar that they need to amend this particular bill so that it accepts people, communities in high-risk areas. I don't think parking solutions, parking permits, restricting the short-term rentals are going to work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any other public comments. We'll close the public comment period and bring it back to the commission to make comments. And I would like to make one overall comment here. You know, so I've been speaking with some of the business people in town, and in San Anselmo as well, actually. And so it's a very strange problem in Marin, in that we have businesses that are narrowing their times, only open 4 days instead of 5, for example. Restaurants that can't find help. And this is kind of, so there is actually a practical problem, you know, associated with this, other than our issue with fire safety and other parking issues. The other side of the coin is that businesses are facing issues finding people when they have to, you know, drag in people from Vallejo, Petaluma, et cetera, East Bay, to work here, and it's difficult. And as we've been saying, and it's absolutely true, we only have so many ways in and out of here. So this fire safety thing has to be addressed, but there is this other side of the coin. And we can't slowly see, you know, our businesses go out of business either. So we need to walk a very fine tightrope here, I think, in this process. Of course, the state wants us to do a certain thing. We have our safety issues, however. So that's just my first comment. Any comments on my left?
Some of the public comments were the same, similar to the ones that I noted. I was especially concerned about if there was a way that we could push back on the setbacks. That was a prime concern of mine. I'd like to, I mean, I think 5 foot is really the minimum that we should have for a side yard, which I think isn't aligned with our code now. And I'd like to see at least a minimum of 10 feet for a rear yard. I think you need more space in the rear yard. I'd like to see the uncovered parking idea be put forward. I've always been a proponent for the for changing the covered parking requirement. So I think that's a way that we can help create more parking on for people. I'm not quite sure. I think in our discussion, before we brought this to council, we had talked about the upper floor windows, and I saw that it was, I think as it was originally proposed, and I just didn't know why, what, was that discussed, or was that decided to go back to what was originally proposed? So, and then I couldn't remember, I think I had originally asked the town attorney about the processing fee, and I couldn't remember what her response was. I was wondering why we had to list what the amount would be if we just say that there was a processing fee, but I think she had a response, and I couldn't remember what it was. But in general, I think that, we do, the fire issues is a very main concern with Fairfax. I think it, there's other towns there's other cities in California who have the same concerns, but it is, and the town in our size, almost the whole town is has this fire threat. So I think it does give us a unique reason why the state law doesn't apply in our jurisdiction.
Any other, okay, go ahead.
Well, I'm trying to figure out, I'm trying to understand, I'm going back and looking at the ordinance. I guess I'm looking at the minimum size, like 1 bedrooms, and going back to what Commissioner Green was saying about how it could be beneficial to have ADUs in the downtown area. It seems like it's the hillsides that are a big problem for a number of reasons. Is there, and I was reading that I guess the ADUs cannot be limited based on lot coverage or floor area ratios. I guess that's a question. Is that correct?
What happens is people can build at least an 850 square foot ADU no matter what. Mm-hmm. So regardless of the size of their lot, they are allowed to build an 850 square foot ADU. I'd have to crunch the numbers to see at what point we could start to apply our .40 FAR. I mean, obviously it would depend on the size of the residence there, but what's the total square footage on the lot where all of a sudden, to build an 851 square foot ADU, we could say you need to have this much area. So we could start to apply that. But there is a point where you would hit that lot size, and then our .40 FAR would come back in.
Mm-hmm. So I'm almost thinking about, if you did the opposite, you said that the ADUs in the hillsides had to be bigger than or a minimum size of, then it would kind of reduce the parking issue, and that's just an idea, just trying to go the opposite way, because then you wouldn't be able to build 2 ADUs in the hillside, So, but I think everything that has been said, I think is, I echo the setbacks and the sewer lateral, and education, I think, might go a long way in terms of what the public thinks, how easy it might be to build one of these, but it's in reality, maybe not too many people can afford to do this in Fairfax. And then just another thought about what we've, talked about in other projects when we're trying to control the endangered species or endangered plants. I don't know if there's something there, but it seems that it's worked in the past, and maybe Commissioner Newton can speak to that. But I'm just thinking of other ways that we can protect our environment and our, I guess, safety.
Any other comments on my left? How about on my right?
I'll start. And I know we'll we've talked a little bit about short-term rentals, and from listening to the council meeting, I think they had talked about wanting to pursue a short-term rental policy in town. So I think at some point this year, it sounds like, from what I understand from listening to the council meeting, that will be coming to us to initiate, correct? That's what I heard from some of the council members, that that was their desire to have that looked at.
Staff is beginning the process of
Right,
exploring.
okay. For me, I think the biggest issue is safety. And, you know, some of the things I brought up when we talked about this was, you know, can we prohibit these in certain zones or portions of zones, sort of an overlay or whatever, based on public safety. So, and I think what I would like staff to do with this is, when you look at AB 881, which was also signed by our local state representatives, it says this bill would instead require a local agency to designate areas based on the adequacy of water and sewer services and the impact of accessory dwelling units on traffic flow and public safety. So what I want to understand from the legislation and who developed this was, in essence, what does that mean? What were they looking at when they put in there that we could restrict these based on traffic flow and public safety? I think without understanding that intent, it's hard for us to then be able to look at the public safety and the fire safety and what we can do with that to protect our community. I think we need to understand what that meaning is, and I would like to see us go to the legislation asking those questions versus going to HCD and asking them what they think that means. And I think once we have a better understanding of that, that may be able to assist us in some of the things we want to do in protecting the community. Because when I listen to the council meeting and the public comments, as well as the comments from the council members, I think the number one concern, and even people said, you know, concern is affordability for me, but over affordability, I would still go back to safety. So I think that was loud and clear, you know, the overall concern. So I would like us to do that. To Laura's comment, and that was one of the things I wrote down, because I think when we went over and drafted the ADU, we tried to put things in there, and we came up with some standards, and we said at the time, okay, we can throw this in now, but we all wanted to come back and revisit some of those. One of the discussion points was Laura had brought up, and I had the same questions. The second, what's in the code is all second-story windows facing the side or rear yard of a property adjoining the side or rear yard of an adjacent property and located 30 feet or less from the property shall have a minimum lower sill height of at least 6 feet above the finished floor. And I know that was, Laura had made comments about egress and the code and the requirements, so I think that was one thing that I questioned whether that was applicable or needed to be relooked. We also addressed landscaping, and we kind of threw in landscaping and said, okay, let's put something there and maybe revisit it. what's in the code is, it discusses protected trees, plus the 2-for-1 replacement. And I went back to the tree ordinance today and kind of zipped through it and actually did kind of a word search for protect or protected trees. And I was unclear as to what that meant. I know we have heritage trees in there and we have discussion, but I think we can look at I mean, these are kind of some small things, but it's still adding to this. I think we need to look at what we really intend there as far as the landscape and protecting our trees. And I know we had the discussion with town attorney at the time when we went through that, and Mimi brought that up, is being careful not to put too many things in there that kind of result in making it impossible to put an ADU in there. But I think, and then we had that discussion, I think, with the trees at that time, but I think that's another area that we can flesh out. I think I think one of the public comments during the council meeting talked about noticing, where we can't have necessarily on some of these, public hearings, but there's nothing to prevent the town from doing some kind of noticing for some of these that only require a building permit. So that's something to look at to make the neighbors be aware or kind of raise any concerns. So I'm just putting that out there. But I think for me, because it triggers so many other things that we're looking at, is going back to the traffic flow and public safety and getting an understanding of what that is and what that means from the perspective of the legislation itself, and then coming back and trying to see how we can work within that to achieve some of the goals we've talked about with safety, with areas we know are problematic, when you take away parking and the narrow roads. So those were my main comments.
Okay, Commissioner Newton.
Commissioner Swift, can I just ask you a little bit more about why you would want to go to the legislature before you would go to HCD to ask some of the questions about what the intent of the legislation was? I would imagine that, it might be interesting to know what a particular legislator was thinking if it's not reflected in the, legislative history. But to me, it's almost more important to know what HCD is going to say as a practical matter. And I just think if, we take too long about this whole process, we run the risk of losing our momentum.
Commissioner Rodriguez?
I'm just
Okay,
asking a
go
question
ahead.
of Commissioner Swift. Don't cut me off.
I'm not cutting you off. Don't worry.
Because I think you're going to the source with the legislation versus HCD's interpretation of that law. To me, I think, you're kind of starting from ground zero where the legislation was written and then going from there, in case you need to address that with HCD. That's just my perspective.
I guess my follow-up question to staff on that would be, does it matter what the legislators say in terms of moving forward, or is the real arbiter of whether or not we're doing something amiss with respect to the legislation up to HCD?
Well, certainly the fact that HCD is given the responsibility to review code for compliance, my recommendation would be to get their input. I became aware of that particular provision dealing with public safety and am already pursuing that question. One of the challenges, I think there's some notwithstanding provisions that might undermine it, but those are the type of questions that, yes, it's like, okay, you're saying public safety, we're saying that there's a public safety issue, and how we say it, by whom is obviously going to have some impact on whether that gets serious consideration. But that might be an angle to take to say, we've got a public safety issue. So,
Well, I think, to me, I think public safety is kind of sometimes a generic thing that's thrown into everything. But what was interesting to me here was the addition of traffic flow. So what does that mean? So again, even though you're going to send your policy to HCD for review, I think having the knowledge of the legislation and the history there, I think, is helpful. So that would be my desire.
yeah, the other challenge is, is that typically it's difficult to communicate with legislators who are outside your district. So we could ask how somebody voted or why or what they thought about it, but in terms of the people that were the actual initiator of that. But it's something we could pursue.
Well, there is somewhat recorded legislative history in the debates, and the public is, free to read that. My experience with legislators who have passed statutes, and you ask them why, and they just say no comment. They don't want to talk about it because it's a group thing like this is, and so an individual legislator doesn't want to be, pinned down to having said anything about what they passed.
That was my suggestion.
So, back to the legislative history, and perhaps we can get some legal analysis of that. Any other comments on that?
Yeah. So in terms of the specific issues that were listed in the staff report, you went over the fire safety, emergency evacuation, parking, short-term rentals, ADU size, et cetera. I think we've missed flood zones, landslide, all these natural hazard areas. I think we can't just focus on the fire. There's all sorts of natural hazards that are possible issues. And then to Commissioner Gonzalez-Parber's point about the environmental issues, we had talked about potentially creating language to limit the ability to cut heritage trees, for example, trees over a certain age, which to me seems like a concrete measurable standard. And so I would really like to explore more some of this historic preservation concepts. I think it was Commissioner Fragoso at one point, one of our previous meetings, who recommended not just structures that are listed as state historic properties, but structures that might be eligible for listing as state historic structures. And I think that so we're missing out on a couple areas that I think are potentially concrete, measurable standards. When we're talking about fire safety, I mentioned the width of the roads. And, it's not just going to be an evacuation out of the town of Fairfax, right? If there's a fire evacuation, it's potentially out of the town of Fairfax into the town of San Anselmo, out of the town of San Anselmo, and you keep going, right? And then you're also dealing with everybody from Forest Knolls and West Marin who's coming through town towards San Anselmo. And that might include Nicasio, other areas, right? So, this whole street and evacuation thing is so scary. I think that's obviously the highest priority for everybody. But for me, the environmental issues are also important. I saw we have the creek, setback in the existing ordinance. So I was really glad to see that. We talked briefly about the extent to which federally protected species, habitat, et cetera, might be another area where state law cannot go to undermine federal protection. And I wonder the extent to which, our owls could be another area where there's concrete, measurable protective zones. So, obviously the owls move around over time, but, is there an owl on your property? Is there a breeding nest there? Those kinds of things, I think, are areas that we could explore. And the other thing on the short-term rentals, actually for all ADUs, I think that the idea of requiring an inventory of structures that are potentially able to be turned into ADUs. Let's get an inventory of all the legal non-conforming structures. An inventory of all the rental units that are being used for Airbnb, and I think an inventory is just it's not saying you can't do something. So to me, requiring an inventory is a way to get a handle on some of the issues that Mr. Egger was talking about in terms of the numbers of units, who's using these units for short-term rental purposes, and how are we ensuring that they're actually ADUs for, affordable living space. And I think that an inventory somehow might help us get a better handle on that.
So along the lines of the inventory of existing ADUs, I think we had talked about that at the last meeting. Correct me if I'm wrong, because we talked about trying to make sure that ADUs are going for arena numbers and that we're being able to count those. And I think the question to staff had been, do you do any kind of an annual survey out to ADU, JADU creators? And I think we even talked about asking them what kind of rent, if they rent it out, what kind of rent do they ask for? So maybe to Mimi's point, we see if we can do that and see if there's a way to put teeth into that, maybe, where they have to answer up to a survey every year on that.
Were you done, Commissioner Newton? Okay, Commissioner.
Okay, so what we have, I'm confused by the ask here again. I'm back to the beginning. We spent hours on the emergency ADU and then the ADU ordinance. We made a recommendation to town council. They approved it. They've conducted the second reading now on the ordinance that'll be effective in 30 days. As part of those hours and hours and hours of discussion, we talked about, I wanted to go way far out, like what we're seeing with this memo from Mr. Egger. I am interested in this level of going out, including what the public recommended with the distance to transit and so on. So if what we're talking about, because the staff recommendation here says, conduct the public hearing, provide staff direction on the ADU work options. I'm not clear then what are the work options? Is the work option that we're talking about that the ordinance that's about to be effective in 30 days, we're initiating an amendment to that? Here, we've just taken all this time to ask everybody their opinions, and I'm not sure what we're doing. I guess my recommendation, if I were that same extreme person I was when we started, was let's initiate an amendment to the ADU ordinance in order to have the discussion like the Frank Yeager memo and the public recommendation. Same time, initiate the amendment discussion on the parking ordinance so we can at least direct some change. But as part of that, if we're going to do that, then yes, I think we do need to have the inventory of existing and potential ADUs, we'll have the severity zone map, but also we need to know which streets in town are one way and where are the evacuation routes over that. So I feel like we're starting a whole new work plan discussion that we already just spent 7 months doing. So I don't really know what we're doing here tonight.
Just to comment on that, I think that we didn't really start this conversation about this particular stuff until November. We haven't spent a great deal of time on this particular thing because it was just 885 that was enacted in October.
And so maybe what we're hearing then is we had some conversations around concepts that were out there but we just needed to get the ordinance done. We got the ordinance done, and now the feedback we're hearing from council is that they may be interested in going further out. So therefore, my recommendation still stands. Let's initiate an amendment to the ADU ordinance and the parking ordinance.
I think, and we had talked about this November, that, because we had a lot of discussions on this and how we wanted to see an ADU ordinance. And the push there was because of the time limit to do the emergency and to get the basic non-emergency one done and in place. And then we had talked about redoing it. At the town council meeting, it was the same thing. So my understanding is we're not looking at amending the existing. We have the emergency, we have the regular one, which is the same language as the emergency one, and now we're to work on a replacement ADU ordinance that would replace that regular one that went into effect.
I'm not sure I see it that way. I mean, the Exhibit A is amendment to town code. Whether we're replacing it or not, we still have to, I believe, tell me if I'm wrong, stick with the primary framework of the emergency ordinance that became, the regular ADU ordinance. Some of my comments have to do with inconsistencies in language of Exhibit A, the amendment to town code. And a lot of that is, there are definitions up front, for example, and the one I want to focus on right now is primary residence, which I don't really like that definition because it has so many different legal connotations. But the ordinance itself doesn't actually discuss, I'm not sure why primary residence was even defined, because as an example, and I don't like the numbering, I hope we go back to, the dot number process, but anyway, under DA, for example, approvals, building permit only, converted to single-family lot, and this is consistent throughout the ordinance, is there's words like a proposed or existing single-family dwelling. Existing single-family dwelling. Is that the same as primary residence? Because primary residence means the largest original residential structure on a site. So I want to just point that out as an inconsistency in the language, because throughout, so again, it's also under D, approvals 1C, converted multifamily lot, multiple ADUs within portions of existing multifamily dwelling. Well, the existing multifamily dwelling isn't really defined. And I think what they're looking at is what is primary residence, which I don't see in the ordinance anywhere mentioned. So, I mean, primary residence is a tax term, really, and maybe we should change that definition. For example, if we're going to use existing multifamily dwelling, instead of saying the largest original residential structure on a site, and calling that primary residence doesn't really make sense if we're not going to use the term. So I just want to point out there are some language issues. So in your work product recommendations, this is one of them, is see where the language might be a little clearer. Tandem parking defined, I'd rather define it as something, is the glass half empty or half full? That's from the 60s, but the idea here is tandem parking means, and let me just read this, okay, and you'll see, 2 or more automobiles are parked on a driveway or in any other location or lot, lined up behind one another. Well, that's kind of a formula for circle. I think one in front of the other may be a better idea, because lined up behind each other, one another doesn't, I think the definition could be clear. So what I'm trying to say generally here is some of the work product that might be recommended to go back over is the language of the ordinance, because there are some inconsistencies. And I see it, basically, and I agree, by the way, with commissioners who have expressed concerns about some of the things raised by Frank Egger and other public comments, and that we need to go beyond, of course, fire, because it relates to the environment, to trees. And when you're protecting trees, I remember our lesson in trees, and the roots go out, 50 feet from a tree. So this is something, when we're talking about protecting trees, we're really also discussing, the tree science of it. And so if roots go out 50 feet, then we have to look at how we are protecting trees. So does the tree committee have a role to play at all in an ADU application? That's another question for Fairfax procedure. So, tree means a woody perennial plant, et cetera, but I think maybe the definition should include, the root structure. And so these are some of the issues I found in the ordinance itself, that there are some language inconsistencies and not using some of the definitions that are set forth, and that needs to be corrected. So that's kind of my personal primary work recommendation to fix this up a little bit. I totally agree with the commissioners who say, this is kind of something we really need to discuss quite a bit. But I think I would like a clearer definition of what the objective standards can be. And some of us have brought up different ideas about that, environmental standards and tree protection standards, and whether we can, fire department recommendations and things like that. That's what I'm hearing from the commission, is we're all looking to get a little clarification on that.
And if I could, Chairman Green, I just want to say a shout out to Mr. Hamer and Mr. Egger for coming here tonight, because they've been very consistent at showing up to these meetings. And I think all of us here really appreciate the fact that there are a number of residents of this town who are really putting just as much thought into these things as we and the staff are. So.
Absolutely. And anybody watching on TV out there, or maybe standing outside the building, can hear me, please come and help us, because we need your help. And we like the public comments. We want as many public comments as we can get. And that's why we're here. We're here so that we can hear what the public have to say about it, and that you can hear what we're thinking as well. Where would staff like to go from here?
Well, your commission has provided the direction we'd hoped for. It's an awful lot to chew. So I think a lot of it is just to try to provide a framework to investigate it. For example, if we're looking at potential structures, what's it gonna, or potential ADUs, the first thing to do would be to say, what's it gonna take to count up all the buildings in Fairfax? So, and I don't know what that answer is, but we could start to.
And you can't trespass. And so there are literally buildings that Mark and I, you can't see from above, you can't see from aerial photographs, and we have to walk down paths through like Scotch broom.
Right.
There is no way you can really do that.
Well,
I'm telling you. You'd have to
but I don't want to
trespass.
come to any conclusions tonight. And yeah, in truth, there's probably some challenges to do that. So that's the question is what is it going to take to respond to some of these questions and put together that methodology to come back to your commission and say, okay, this is what we heard, tell us if we heard it right, and this is what we think it will take in terms of length of time and stuff like that. It's obviously a very open-ended question. I mean, there's some interesting or maybe dominant themes that we could explore, and obviously staff is going to address those as well, or fold that, what appears to be the most fruitful way to pursue this, because one of the questions challenges we always have is how much bandwidth do we have to explore everything? And I think that was part of our recommendations to say, okay, what's within our control? I don't know if we're going to get anywhere trying to talk to legislators, but we can start that line of inquiry and see where it leads us. So we'll just take these notes, discuss it internally, route things to appropriate parties. Obviously, we've already indicated that we want to talk to fire because the safety issue is kind of, it's the primary concern. There's a lot of other concerns, but if this thing ends up making public safety noticeably worse in Fairfax, then, what are we really doing? I mean, in terms of our fundamental purposes as, planning department and as a planning commission, I mean, if we're not addressing that underlying issue, who cares about housing? I mean, if we're going to burn it down, I mean, Santa Rosa seems to be in a 40-year cycle in certain areas to burn down all their housing, and so, the question is, well, do you want to rebuild all that housing in that same location? I mean, maybe you do. Maybe that's what you accept.
Well, and to that point, I mean, that's why I'm pushing the traffic flow and public safety definitions, because I think that's key to everything else. And what I heard from the community was their concern as well. And some of the community saying, we stand up for some things historically in Fairfax, and we've taken leadership in that. And what better or more important item is something like this that affects potentially, as everybody has commented on, the public safety of the community. When do you stand up and make that effort? And I heard that from the community. So, I think it, as opposed to just, what do we think we can fit in here?
Right, and
Yeah.
and the state and U.S. Supreme Courts have for hundreds of years defined the police powers of a local government as the health and safety and welfare of its citizens.
Yeah,
And-
so
and-
we need to jump into both the what are we actually defining as the safety issue? How is this legislation and what we're actually seeing? Because it's not just our feelings about it. It's what can we observe, as we start to get these applications that convert garages on streets that have X width. And as we have this conversation with the fire professionals to say, if we're going to put a red line around an area that says this is a really bad place to add additional cars to the street, those are the conversations. And then once you have that methodology or something, you can say, okay, this is what we think public safety and traffic flow means. And then maybe that's the question about, do we want to make a stand there? And Commissioner Newton pointed out that, it's not like we get them to the San Anselmo border and then it's, all bets are off. This obviously, people trying to get on a good day with nothing going on, we know that right now you can miss lights. And so, you put people under an emergency evacuation and that type of stress, what's it going to take to keep that traffic moving? Those are questions that need to be put to the fire department to try to get an honest assessment to say, well, what are the implications for fire and other public safety personnel to monitor that traffic and keep it going? Once we have those type of answers, I think we can come back to the fundamental purposes behind what we're trying to achieve in government, even if we're trying to balance other overarching concerns like, people can't afford to live here anymore. So, but we'll take these pages of notes, and Linda's been doing it, and we have an excellent minutes clerk, and so she'll give us her draft, and we'll be back to your commission in February and just carry on this conversation.
So we don't need to make any motion or anything. You have our recommendations, and you can take those on. Are there any more comments?
I just wonder whether we should have some kind of a working session with the fire department or something.
Yeah, I was going to say that the fire department is the most restrictive, just in terms of development, and maybe that's a good place to start. Without getting into the weeds, I was thinking about their fire truck hose reach. That's going to limit, because they can only go so far. That's going to limit a lot of the development. But so maybe that's a place to start.
And that's exactly kind of what is the handful of questions that we would need to talk about? And maybe we're asking them things like that. What are the 3 things that you used, or what are the evacuation routes, or what are the, whatever, and then maybe we know where the ADUs already existing are, and then here's this map. What is this telling us? What are some of the questions that this is saying? Or I don't know, something like that. I feel bad that they're just going to write it up and come back to us, and we're not the experts. What are we going to say at that point?
I'd like to follow up with that if I can. I've been sitting here thinking also the same question, what is it that we're being asked to do here when this came before us previously? I don't remember how many times we reviewed it, but we went over it ad nauseum, and we're always told, no matter what we came up with, that we couldn't do it because we're bound by the restrictions of the law and the code, and you can only do what legal counsel instructed us to do. And in fact, they say, don't worry about that. We'll put it into legal language. Just give us your comments and we'll tell you what it is. And then council comes back and says, send it back to the planning commission and have them fine tune it and perfect it. I think it's council should have taken the time to fine tune and perfect it and go to legal counsel. We don't have legal counsel.
But I think
they can go to legal counsel and talk to their fire department because they have the purview over those departments. We have none.
But I think the issue again was for the emergency one, and what do you call the other one? Just the regular one, was the intent to get those in place as soon as possible. And everyone had the idea from the council and even us when we were talking about it at the planning commission that we wanted to come back after that process went through, when we met that time frame, so we were covered, to redo the ADU ordinance and make a new one. So that's why we're here doing this, because we wanted to do that. That's also what the council wants us to do, now that we have the time to do it.
Well, whether it's a wholly new ordinance or whether it's sort of an amendment of the ones that we passed recently, you hear many of the comments. I mean, the setbacks, 4 feet, 3 feet. How can we, with fire danger, fire being able to pass between buildings easier, et cetera. So these are really key comments, and hopefully all of the jurisdictions that are facing these questions will join together to go back to the legislature or the courts at some point and see, what exceptions can be made for areas where we have high fire danger. And if we have high fire, next winter we're going to have high floods and high earth movement, and there's more than one type of danger around here, which you'd kind of, with some of the public comment, you don't get in some of the flatter cities around California, but we do get it here. So if there are no more comments, we could close the discussion items and move on to a discussion of the minutes, but I don't want to foreclose anybody either, so.
Can I ask
You
your fellow-
can't. No, you go ahead.
Hey, give me that gavel. Can I ask my fellow commissioners if anybody wants to take a 5-minute break, or do you all want to just go forward? Break?
I could
Can we
use
have a
little
break, Chair?
No problem.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're back in session, and we are now at the point where commissioners can make comments on the minutes.
I have one correction. Page 11, first sentence under the planning director's report, AUD should be ADU. That's all I have.
And then on page 7, the only Commissioner Rodriguez comment, the sentence should read, "She is not prepared to go any farther with the limited information that had been provided to date." It's not the only, it's limited. Thank you.
On page 3, down at the bottom, my comment asked Mr. Hammer how many total units, and when, should say, were in the building. They were proposing, I think it should be scratched, but what I was trying to say was I was asking how many total units were in the building itself. Yeah, just how many units they had, so.
I had no comments on the minutes. Anyone else?
With those amendments, I'll make a motion to adopt the minutes with the changes as proposed.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed?
Aye.
No. Okay, thank you. The minutes are as amended. Now we have the planning director's report, please.
Very briefly. And then I talk for a long time. Okay, I won't say it anymore, but this will be brief. There is a really good SSU, Sonoma State University Planning Commissioners Conference coming up, proposed on February 1. And I'm actually sorry to miss this because you've got Barb Couts speaking, who's one of the lead experts. So, this is one of these things where I want to go there so I know what she tells you, because you're going to know stuff that I don't know, but I'm not going to.
I'm going.
Maybe I can.
I'm going.
Okay, I can importune. Ms. Neal to take her time, but those are always fun. And they're geared specifically towards planning commissioners and the questions and things like that. And I believe Commissioner Rodriguez had already indicated that she was considering going or was going to go. Okay,
I went last year, and it was really good.
so why don't I do the reservations?
I already did mine, and I'm going to submit a thing after.
We'll tell you what, if you want to do that too, that'd be easiest for me, but it's your choice if you want me to. Okay. Register. Is there anybody else who wants to do? Okay, and this, I think, should have report outs to the commission at the following meeting. But, yeah, would you like me to resend that? So, okay, so.
What you,
That's always the question. I believe I sent it to your normal, where there's planning commission and then it just filters out. to
It
the
would have
group.
been like a month or so ago,
Yeah, it
so
was a while
check
ago.
back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
so those of us who aren't going would be anxious to hear from those who do go,
Yeah.
especially about things that maybe we are not cognizant of at the moment. So thank you for those who aren't, I can't go, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and then there's also, and I thought I wrote it down, the League of California Cities Planning Commissioner Conference, which, of course, Commissioners Newton and
What's the deadline for registration? Do you recall?
those, I don't know what the deadline is, but I can tell you that it sells out typically, now this is in Sacramento, I believe. Excuse me?
You said you were going to register us?
Well, I would like to know which commissioners are interested in, taking that time to go to that conference.
When is the League of California Cities?
I don't have that on me. I'm just mentioning, no, it's further out. So, okay, so I will get that information and resend it to you and see that. But the nice thing about that is they get a bunch of experts and they cover a broad variety of topics. I mean, LOCC does a great job. So that's another good one to go to. And the town does have a bit of a budget. So, one or two commissioners that are interested. And then finally, and I regret not having some, piece of sheepskin to give Commissioner Curling for her outstanding service, but I will put something together. No stalwart of government service should go unrecognized. And I hope I'm not breaking the news to people, but she has announced her intention to not seek renewal of her term. And so I just want to express my thanks. I really, really appreciate the quality of the people and the expertise that they bring. And Laura, it's been a true pleasure working with you. So best wishes in your future endeavors. And again, people who are currently working, I don't know how you do it, frankly, because this is my job and I don't know how I do it sometimes. So, to carve out that time in your busy schedules is.
Laura, is this your last meeting, or you're not staying on until there's a replacement?
Yeah, I have been asked by the town clerk's office if I could stay on until they found a replacement commissioner, so I have agreed to do that.
So
Thank you.
If the tree committee's
Thank
any
you.
indication, we'll have her for the next 2 years.
I have a good suggestion for Planning Commission. I've mentioned it to her, but I'm not sure she can work it into her schedule. Liesl Blash, who's on our Affordable Housing Committee,
Well, this is,
and her skills are
Yeah.
not used there, so she would be an excellent Planning Commissioner.
yeah, this brings up a good point, is if commissioners are aware of individuals who are community-minded and, kind of work well with others, and have that type of mindset that lends itself to spending hours on very, granular topics. So feel free to mention that to staff. And, we do actually at times recruit people or suggest that it would be neat to see them on, this type of a thing. So-
Well, and all of us have different skills, and I think Commissioner Caroline, with her particular set of skills has been, a sort of critical part of this team, you know. So if you have ideas regarding somebody that you think may have similar skills to your own, let us know. We'd appreciate your thoughts.
I don't at this moment, but I'm sure there are a number of candidates worthy in the town of Fairfax who could, take on the duties.
And also when
No, you're going to be.
Laura
invited to
does
follow.
leave, we'd like to know when the last meeting is that you will be attending.
Well, I want to echo what Ben said. Yeah, you're absolutely invaluable part of this. I mean, I wouldn't have known about, wall heights, concrete quality, all the architectural things that you've given us to review. Thank you for all that. Any other parts of your report?
No, that's it.
Okay.
Ben, could we get a sense, next meeting or the one after, what our workload looks like and our priorities over the next 6 months or so I can plan to be out of town?
Sure, I have to be careful about how I structure that because some people think that work updates constitute having a Brown Act violation, but we'll sort it out.
So we'll move on to commissioner comments and requests.
Okay.
And I actually have one comment. I want to commend the pub in town for demonstrating how you can pump beer without electricity during our power failure, because they stayed open and until they ran out of pressure, they were able to sell beer. So I thought that was an incredibly
pub was
good.
that?
That was the Iron Springs
Oh, yeah.
Pub. Iron Springs, thank you very much.
So along those lines, cannabis, we have an application, and what I had asked for, I thought would be helpful for the rest of the commissioners, so that we had it and could look at it now before we have an application come before us. A list of the applicable code sections. We can go online and read them if they're up there. Also, the final criteria and scoring information we would need. And then any reference to what might be on the town's website relative to applications that we should be aware of, because I know there's some stuff up there. And so those 3 items. And that would be great if we could have that
Yeah,
sooner rather than later when we get an application.
we could get you the ordinance that adopted the cannabis regs, the 2 chapters, and then obviously the criteria. And you asked for that, and we will get that in advance of when we schedule this application for your review, because there's just one business, and obviously we're not going to discuss that tonight. And I could talk to you about the last item offline.
Yeah, I just want it, it'd be helpful for us to have it before we get the packet. I think it's helpful for us to do our homework before that and not have it in the packet that, with the application, that we have to then do our homework on. Whereas now when we have things come before us, a lot of it is already, the code, and we have that, and we know that, and we can go to that. So this is a little bit different.
I just wanted to make the other commissioners aware that I attended this Clean Power Exchange webinar, and what this is the community choice aggregators in the state joined together to kind of talk, in this particular webinar, to talk about resiliency, responding to the electric grid outages. And the community choice aggregators are separate and apart from the public utility. They formed as part of a joint powers authority, and they separately purchase energy, renewable energy under long-term contracts, and then offer that energy back to communities using the local utility distribution line. But they're purchasing all renewable energy, which is addressing greenhouse gases and global climate change. But as I say, the purpose of this webinar was to talk about all of the shutoffs and what they are doing as community choice aggregators to address this topic. And it was really interesting because what they're doing within their sphere of influence, and we have one here in Marin, there's one in Sonoma, and one in the Peninsula area, and they were talking about how they're doing analysis of the needed grid repairs, kind of looking at circuits and substations and switches and looking at what needs to be replaced and repaired, and then going after grants and training contractors and working with PG&E to prioritize areas for receiving backup power simultaneously to improving the grids in the area. So they're focusing on schools, retail, and homes. They're also doing other really interesting thing in that they're doing microgrid testing. So they're looking at much smaller areas within the larger power service areas where they're testing resiliency through small grid utility work by doing a combination of things like trying to do kind of demand response. So folks who have renewable energy panels, taking that, storing it locally, and redistributing it to a small grid area, so a neighborhood or a commercial zoned area. So instead of that renewable energy going back into the public utility and then being distributed to whomever, being localized and kept locally, which is really, really cool. They were also kind of cautioning us about PG&E doing microgrid power. They're going out right now for RFPs for folks to do something very similar, but of course they have, they're focusing on natural gas, which is not, one of the least focused energies we really want to focus on. And so they're more focused, community choice aggregators, on solar and batteries, and so that's a lot better solution, I think. So I just wanted folks to kind of know about that, because I think there are people out there who are doing really, really great work. The only other thing I wanted to ask staff about was I'm noticing all these pink ties and tree, like PG&E, my neighbors are all being noticed that PG&E is going to be doing mass cutting in our neighborhood of trees. And I just am wondering, so there's all these bay trees, oak trees, non-native trees also that have these ties around them, but there's probably 50 just in this fruit stick circle right here. And I was wondering whether it was an arborist who's working on behalf of PG&E to identify and work with a tree cutter to do the proper cutting, because some of these trees are like supporting the hill. And so I don't know what you know about that.
No, but we'll research that and just put out an email with our understanding. I mean, I could say that I've observed PG&E hired crews working on line clearance already, and I know that is very much in their work program. I mean, so we're hearing that, yeah, it's starting, including in Fairfax. So I think I would be 90% certain that what you're seeing is, yeah, a lot of tree removal, a lot of limb removal. In terms of whether pink means they're going to take down the tree or just get that 10-foot clearance or something, I don't know.
Right. And I think that makes a lot of sense, when the ground is flat. When we start getting up into trees that are sustaining the hill, and the hill is wet, and it's they're already precarious, what they decide to do is really going to be important. So I'm guessing in the next 2 weeks, you guys will be getting a lot of calls because they don't know if it's who it is, right? They think it's a street tree, they'll think it's street workers.
Can I just?
Yeah, something that staff has already commented to PG&E was we want all that work to be done to ISA, International Silvicultural Association standards. Now, that in a quarter will get you whatever. So that's one of the concerns too, is if they just go out there and buzz cut trees, you actually make the problem worse because you get water sprouting and, future limb failures and things like that. So that was just something I threw in there to say, if you guys are going to do it right.
Can I just tell you what I was told in my neighborhood, and I don't know if that applies. That was probably in the summer, is that they are only limbing back 10 feet and only for the electrical wires and nothing else, because I asked them to cut back some other stuff, and they said, no, we can only cut back for, because we have a lot of trees for cable and other, lines. But no, they said only the electrical lines. And you look at the very thin lines, those are the ones that they're trying to clear. I had a question, if nobody else.
Could I ask Commissioner Rodriguez for that webinar? Is that posted online anywhere, do you know? Yeah. Could you send out the link? Thanks.
I just had a question about the bus stop at the arcade. I was walking by there last weekend and I noticed that it has like a temporary canopy. The bench is still there, but there was like a canopy temporary. Is that just temporary?
Oh yeah, they've got a very nice craftsman style replacement that they're getting into the, what are we bidding on the contract and who's going to do this and who's going to do that. So who's the gentleman that's ramrodding that? Yes. So it's going to be a very attractive bus shelter. And they're going to also try to put in some kind of, what do they call that? The windows that they're using.
A weather barrier?
Well, it's a weather barrier, yeah. So that's another concern is, how to make it comfortable for people sitting there when the wind's blowing sideways and you don't just get those nice vertical drips at the eve edge. So look forward to that being completed probably about when the weather stops raining. But no,
I was going to say, is there a projected date of completion?
no, it's going
Next
to
year?
take the time it takes, yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, any more commissioner comments and requests? Hearing none, then can we entertain a motion to adjourn?
I'll move to adjourn.
And all in favor?
Aye.
None. Thank you. Thank you very much.